Okay, I am David, and I am on the second part of chapter 3. Remember, he said he needed to learn how to smile. And manage he did during the following weeks. Only 2 days later, in a town called Naples, he found a small mirror. A woman walking along the street dropped it. A corner broke off, and so he made a face and left it there. David waited till she was out of sight and then picked it up. You could still see yourself in it anyway. Clutching it in his hand, he walked on till he came to a place where there were trees and dried grass right in the middle of the town. There was a seat, and there David sat down and held up the mirror. At first, his hand shook so much he could not see properly. But soon, very soon, a face appeared clearly in the mirror. It was his own. It did not look ugly. No, he honestly could not see what could be wrong with it. It was thin, but so were many people's faces. The color of his hair perhaps was not quite right. Possibly it should have been a darker brown. He held the mirror close to his face and took a good look at his eyes. Johannes had had blue eyes. Here in Italy, they all had dark brown or black eyes. But you could have had other colors. David strove to recall what the eyes of the men in the camp had looked like, but all he could remember clearly was that they were dull, whereas his own now looked very bright. Was there something wrong with dark gray eyes? Perhaps there was a touch of green in them if you looked carefully. He still could not understand in what way they were strange, and so he dismissed the thought. There was nothing else to do but look away when anyone looked at him for any length of time. Many times a day, during the days that followed, he took out his mirror and practiced smiling, but he could not get it right. He could not make it look the way it did when other people smiled, and in the end he gave up. He continued to go northward. Not that he wanted to do as the man had told him, but he obviously had to go somewhere, and that was the direction the English people had taken. Without being fully aware of it, David had some idea at the back of his mind that he might perhaps go to England. During his first days of freedom, he had had but one thought from morning to night. Okay, and here's a statement on freedom, guys. During his first days of freedom, he had had one thought from morning to night, and this is on page 79. When he woke up, it had taken the form. If they haven't caught me by this evening, and as he lay down to sleep, if they don't catch me tomorrow. He now began to believe that he might possibly remain free for a long time to come, perhaps until winter overtook him. And as soon as he opened his eyes in the morning to the pleasant warmth of the sun, he would feel sure that he would reach a country where he could live in safety. The idea of earning some money had been a good one. He had earned no money in Naples, but he had fetched coffee for people who sat eating in a restaurant, and the waiter had given him a loaf of bread for his pains. And in a small town farther north, he had been given money by some strangers who were afraid of having their luggage stolen from the car while they went into the church. He had heard them talking and had offered to stand by and keep an eye on their things until they came back. He realized afterward that he did not know what he would have done if anyone had attempted to take the bags. But fortunately, no one had tried, and he had been given so much money that he was able to buy enough bread for 2 days. David's chief difficulty was that people asked so many questions. But as he gained in experience from all he saw about him, he was gradually able to improve upon his story of the circus. He had learned by this time that people had no evil intentions when they questioned him, and since he was pretty good at slipping away before they began to look too anxiously at him, he was no longer quite so frightened. The Italians did not ask so many questions, but it was easier to earn money from the tourists who were on vacation from other countries. And so David embroidered his tale of the circus until he thought it sounded absolutely genuine. When he was asked where he was going to rejoin the circus, he would invent a name so that however suspicious his questioners might be afterwards, they would not be able to trace him. Hey, Isaac, can you come sit closer to me? Because I'm having to talk loud and my voice is really straining. I know, that's why I bought them. The sun continued to shine with a pleasant warmth day by day, but it was now beginning to grow cold at night. David was quite determined, however, never to enter a house. Houses were dangerous places. You never knew what someone might be standing in the doorway, barring your exit the very moment you wanted to slip away. How's it going, Gabe?
Good. I got super thirsty.
Well, get some water. Every time he came to a town, he would walk around till he found the church. He promised himself that if he was not caught and came to a country where he could live in security, he would go inside one and see what it looked like. Not that he really expected that he would be able to preserve his freedom long enough for that. It was best not to be too sure. But sometimes when he had had enough to eat, and found a comfortable place to sleep in, and sat gazing at the hills and valleys and the sun shining on the distant mountains, he could not help feeling that perhaps he might be lucky. It was now a long time since he had seen the sea, but although he missed it, there was plenty to interest him. There did not seem to be one dull, uninspiring place in the whole of Italy. All his life, David had seen nothing but the same ugly, flat, gray scene, and now he never grew tired of tramping through the ever-changing countryside. Every time he came to a bend in the road, he was afraid the beauty of the scene would disappear. But each time a new beauty was revealed in the constantly changing landscape of green and undulating hills and valleys. David had now learned what some of the trees were called. There were olives with their gnarled trunks and pale gray-green leaves, whispering and quivering in the lightest breeze as if they were alive. Gabe, I do have a pizza in that blue container there. If you like pesto, you'd probably love that. You can have those. I have deli meat. You can make some sandwiches.
I have 3, Mom. Is that fine?
Whispering and quivering in the lightest breeze as if they were alive. And there were cypresses, tall and slender, pointing straight up into the sky. Best of all were those places where a river flowed through the valley bottom. There he could sit for hours on end, wondering where the river came from and where it ran to. There, too, he could wash. His piece of soap had grown quite small now, and although he did not use it every day, he dared not wash in the towns when he filled his water bottle at the pump, for he had never seen anyone washing there, and it might have been forbidden. And it usually is. You usually don't wash in those pumps. You usually just gain water. It was Sunday today, the day that people were most full of laughter and the shops were shut. That did not matter, since David had not earned any money for 2 days and could not have bought bread anyway. He had found a bunch of grapes, however, and he was used to doing with very little food. It would soon be evening, and he was sitting by the roadside thinking over a plan he had in mind since the day before. He could not make up his mind whether he dared to try it. The day before, he had seen a man walking along the road, and when a car came by, he had held up his hand and stopped it. The driver had put his head out and asked if the other wanted a lift, and the man who had been walking said, "Yes, please." He did. But you had to say where you were going, and suppose the driver became suspicious. In that case, you were caught, and you could not get out. David trembled at the thought, but still could not quite give up the idea. A car traveled at an immense speed, so he's thinking of hitchhiking, basically, which was legal, and still it's illegal in most places in the U.S., but there are places that it's still legal. You cannot hitchhike, you cannot take a minor over the border. You can get in big trouble for that. State. You probably cannot, you're right. But if you cross a state border, it's really bad. Kidnapping. A car traveled at an immense speed, and if he kept going in the same direction, he must at some point leave Italy behind. It was very beautiful there, but as the days went by, David seemed to prize his freedom more and more. When he had first arrived and was living on the rocks by the sea, his freedom had not meant so much to him, since he had not expected it to last more than a day or two. But now that he enjoyed it so long, he could no longer think of giving it up. As his fear of losing his freedom had grown, his desire to reach a place of safety had become so strong that he could now think of nothing else. David wondered whether it were always like that, whether when you had something, you not only wanted to keep it, but wanted something else as well. It seemed greedy, but he could not help it. And here's another freedom quote on page 83. Freedom in a country where he could live in safety. David wanted both. But nothing more, he told himself. Just those two things, and that will be enough. Johannes said greedy people can never be happy, and I would so much like to know what it feels like to be happy. Johannes said that when you very much want something you haven't got, you no longer care for what you have got. Yes?
Was that 183?
83. Chapter 3, page 83. I'm not sure that I understand, but I suppose he meant that things are only worth having if you think they are. David tried to forget that he also wanted a new piece of soap. If he could preserve his freedom and reach a free country, he must be satisfied with that. And if he could bring himself to ask for a lift, he would get to another country all the more quickly. If only he could find out whereabouts those other countries lay. He dared not ask anyone, for if you said you belonged to a circus, then you would be expected to know your way about, and so it might prove dangerous to show your ignorance. David's thoughts were disturbed by the sound of a car. It sounded wrong, as though the engine were not running properly. He lay down flat in the grass and watched it crawl along in no more than a walking pace. It was American, not Italian. He had long since taught himself the meaning of the letters on license plates. Americans were most likely good people, for they were the ones they hated most. All that was wrong with them, David thought, was that they spoke English very oddly and always acted as if they were proud of possessing so much. There was one thing, however, that these two Americans did not possess. They had no gas, as they called petrol, and that was why their car would not go. David stood up and took a step toward them. The woman was talking in a loud, angry voice that did not sound at all pleasant, and David was more nervous than he usually was when he was going to speak to someone. But he stopped when he had asked the man if he could help by fetching some gas for them. They were both very glad to accept his offer, and David suggested that he take their can, and go to the village farther up the side of the hill. But I haven't had any money to pay for the gas, he said as he took the can. The man was about to take some money out of his pocket when the woman said quickly, "He's nothing but a young beggar, Richard. You can't be quite sure if we give him money, we shall never see him again. He can get help from a garage up there." She did not, of course, intend David to understand what he said. He wondered if they thought he was stupid. They seemed to think he could understand only when they spoke very slowly. The man asked if he could get a mechanic to drive down with the gas. "The can's a bit heavy for you to carry," he said. David turned his back on the woman. "The people here don't like doing very much on Sundays, and so I can't be sure I can find anyone willing to drive down," he explained politely. "But I'll see if I can get the gas by promising to pay for it later, unless, of course, your wife thinks that I want to keep your can." The man looked uncomfortable. "That wouldn't work, boy," he said. "Then you'd have to go twice. My wife was only thinking you might drop the money." As David took the piece of paper money he was offered, he looked the man straight in the face. "Will you look after my bundle while I go? Then I can carry the can better." Both the man and the woman went red in the face, and David set off without waiting for an answer. They were ashamed of themselves, and that was all David wanted. He had never taken anything he knew that belonged to someone else, only fruit growing on trees and bushes and things he found. That he was sure of. Suppose somebody took his bundle. When the woman had accused him of wanting to take their money, his first impulse had been to walk away. But they had to have petrol, and it was a more telling gesture to leave them his bundle to look after. It was like saying to them, "You think I want to steal from you, but I am David. And since that's what you think, I'm leaving my bundle behind to show you that I think better of you than you do of me." And they understood what he meant, too. He could tell that from their faces. When they heard up at the filling station in the village that it was an American car that had run out of petrol, they insisted upon driving down themselves with enough to fill the tank. And as David had to return anyway to fetch his bundle, they took him with them in their Vespa. David handed the American his unused money, and taking his bundle, he turned to go. "Wait a bit, boy. You must have something for your trouble." David would have been only too glad to accept something from them. He was in desperate need of money to buy a loaf of bread for the next day. But he could not bring himself to take it now. He wanted to earn his money, not just have it given to him. But he did not want to earn it from someone he did not like. "No, thank you," he said firmly. "I like to earn money sometimes, but only when I want to. I don't need any today." That was not true, but it felt good to say so. It was like saying, "I am David." There they are using the title again. "I am David, and I make my own decisions, and no one has any right to tell me what to do." He ran off in the dusk away from the road and pretended not to hear the American calling him to come back. He was very hungry when he awoke the next morning. He was in need of water, too, for he had only a few drops. He had left the last village of the evening before some way behind him, but he could see another, a somewhat bigger place down in the valley. He might be able to earn some money there, but he was by no means certain of it. The evening was the best time to earn money, and the best time to be in town, too, because he could then escape quickly into the shelter of the darkness. But today he would have to go into town in daylight. He could not wait until evening to get more water. He opened his bundle to drink what was left. At the bottom of his bundle he found a strange box, the sort used for cigarettes. And in the box there was money, more money than David had ever seen, 2,000 lire. Lire?
No, that's Turkish.
Well, Lire is the plural, but it's 1 lira. And lira is what they use in Turkey, but I think it's probably also used in Italy. So 1 lira was not very much. You could get practically nothing for 1 lira, but 2,000? So the people had gave him money. As well as the money, there was something written on a slip of paper, a letter. David had never had a letter, and he almost wished he did not have one now, for he found it very difficult to read handwriting, and he had never tried reading English. But he would not give up. There was such a terrible lot he did not know, and if he did not do something about it, he would just go on being as stupid and ignorant as he had been in the camp. and then he would be caught. You had to help yourself. You had to find out things, or you could not succeed. So after an hour, he was fairly sure he knew what was in the letter. It was the American man who had written it, and he was quite sure David would not accept money, and so he had hidden it in the bundle. He also said they were sorry that they had thought he might steal. Not all strange boys are honest, you know, wrote the American, but we are sorry we suspected an honest boy. We did not mean you to understand what we said, and we would be glad if you would take use of this money to show we have no hard feelings toward you, or to show you have no hard feelings toward us. And then came a name that David could not read. David's first thought would he was now be able to buy a new cake of soap. He had money for bread for many days, and there would still be enough for soap, and perhaps a comb too. He told himself that he must not be greedy. Johannes had not liked people to be greedy, and it would be a good thing to keep some of the money to purchase more bread later on. He would buy soap and perhaps one or two other things, but no more. And he would not be in a hurry. He would first consider carefully what he most needed. The result was that he bought a loaf of bread, a cake of soap, and a comb. Combing his hair was painful, for no one in the camp had had a comb for a very long time, and David's hair had not been combed since. His hair had a slight wave. He was glad of that because most people here in Italy had wavy hair, but it looked as if it were growing lighter in color, and it was very long. David reflected seriously, and then he bought himself a pair of scissors and a pencil and a small pad of notepaper as well. The scissors to cut his hair with so that he would not look out of place, and the pencil and paper because for many days now he had wished he could write. Johannes had begun to teach him once. Perhaps if he could practice, he could learn to do it properly. It might stand him in good stead to be able to write. One never knew when it might prove useful. He was not used to having more money than the piece of the loaf of bread, and he found himself his unexpected wealth a problem. He had now spent almost half of it. The scissors had been expensive. Still, he would have had enough to buy bread for some days to come, and he had a great desire to try some cheese. If he could get a bit for 50 lira. It tasted good, even better than he remembered it. He had once had it in the camp and again in the truck on the road to Salonika. When he had satisfied his hunger, he began cutting his hair. He was sitting under an olive tree so bent that it very nearly touched the ground, and he placed his mirror on the lowest branch so that it leaned up against the trunk. Cutting the tufts at the back of his neck, where he could not see what he was doing, proved a tricky business, but at length he was satisfied with the result. He wondered if he dared try out his plan of getting a lift. If he chose one of those trucks that carried foodstuffs, they never drove them. But every time a truck approached, he lacked the courage to try, although he had made up his mind to do it. He was so frightened that he could feel his heart beat faster and his throat grow tight. And then he thought of God. God of the green pastures and the still waters, he said softly, I am David, and I am frightened. Not just ordinary fear that you always have, worse than that. I want to beg a lift so I can get quickly to another country, but I daren't. If you're strong enough to do something about what people think and feel right inside themselves, then will you please take this fear from me, just long enough for me to wave to a truck? And if it isn't greedy to ask for two things at once, will you let it be a good man that comes in the next one? I haven't yet found anything I can do for you. I am David. Amen. It seemed that God was Huh? He keeps saying that. It's his name, so he keeps kind of telling him, like, it's me, David. It seemed that God was strong enough, for when the next truck came along, David was no longer too frightened to get up and step into the roadway. The truck driver looked exactly like the sailor who had helped him on the ship. David waved, and the man pulled up and asked where he was going, and David answered, to Perugia, as he had decided he would when he formed his plan. Perugia was a long way. It would take him 3 days to walk there. And so there he was, sitting in the truck by the side of the stranger who was so like the sailor. And when he had once told his tale about the circus, the man asked him no questions at all, obviously preferring to do the talking himself. He was called Angelo, and he told David a great deal about his home and his family. He had both a father and a mother and many brothers and sisters. And then there was a woman called Rita whom he wanted to marry when he had saved enough money to buy a truck of his own. But his father wanted him to marry someone called Clorinda, and her father had a vineyard. Not much changes, right? The guys still want a truck to impress the girls. There you go. He talked about it for a long time, as if he were not sure which of them he should marry, and he asked David what he thought. David considered the matter. Are they both good people, he asked finally? For if there's any difference, you see, I think you better marry the one that's good and kind. You could buy a vineyard yourself.
You know what he needs to do?
What?
He needs to buy a crappy truck, and whatever girl's willing to ride with him.
There you go. Maybe that's what David's going to tell him. If you're willing to get in my cruddy truck.
If you'll drive and mess with me, then you're the one.
Yep. For if there's any difference you see, I think you better marry the one that's good and kind. You could buy a vineyard yourself perhaps when you've earned enough money. But I think you've got to decide for yourself. Perhaps your father hasn't thought whether they're kind. You must make quite sure about it before you choose. Angelo frowned and then he smiled and nodded. I think you're a very clever boy, he said. I'll do what you say. Then he chatted on about his plans for the future, and David listened, but not with the same attention as before. Angelo was stupid. He was a good man, but he was stupid. David was puzzled, for he always thought that good people must be clever. He thought about it for a long time. Could he have been mistaken? He knew so little about anything. But no, Angelo was a grown man, and here was one thing he was quite free to decide for himself, and yet he was ready to let others make up his mind for him. That could only be stupidity. When they had been driving for several hours, Angelo pulled up and shared his food with David. He gave him a drink from his bottle of wine as well, and a little later they came to Perugia. It was a large town situated on the top of a hill, and there was a very big church that could be seen from the road. David asked to be put down partway up the hill, and when Angelo had driven on, he walked back to the point where the main road continued into the countryside. He had no need of either bread or water, and unless he had been in town during the daytime, he preferred to remain in the open. His plan to stop for a truck and ask for a lift had gone off very well. Perhaps he would stop another the next day, provided he were not too frightened. But he would have to do it on his own, since he had not found anything he could do in return. He could not go on asking God for things. It would be greedy. And God might very soon grow tired of a boy who was always frightened and could never do anything for himself. And suppose he grew tired of him the very day something happened that David could not possibly deal with by himself. David did not know that the very next day something would happen that he could not tackle alone, and he would still would not ask for help. And that's the end of chapter 3 from I Am David.